Hey, folks, welcome back to the Contrarians. This is another special episode where we have a special guest in the hot seat. Last time we had Tim on the show, we were doing a worst of where we were both agreeing. And actually, this is going to be interesting. Tim just mentioned that this is going to be a little different because this is going to be an album that we're going to disagree on a little bit. So basically, the Contrarians is a show where we pick an album from a band that's more of a dark horse album, and one of us who's in the hot seat will champion an album that they think really is the best, or they feel very strongly that it's their personal favorite. And the other person, which today is me, is going to come at them with some objective statistics, a little subjective information and stuff like that, and try to argue why, no, the general consensus is right on this one. So today we're going to be tackling the band Kansas, and Tim has a very contrarian pick for his favorite Kansas record. And I'm going to throw it over to Tim, and he's going to let us know a little bit about the band and what album he's picking for his contrarian pick and why. So take it away, Tim.
Thanks, Marco. Thanks for letting me back on the Contrarians, the first actual Contrarians show. Kansas band that I've been a huge fan of for a long time. To me, they don't get the even though they're a big selling band, they've sold a lot of records and they've certainly got songs that a lot of people know. I don't think that they're regarded as well, quite highly as they should be, because I think they're a pretty amazing band. One of the very few bands to be considered progressive rock from America. I mean, they are from Topeka, Kansas. And so they started, I think they started around 1970, and they were a combination of a couple of bands. There was a band that I think was called Kansas, and then a band that was called White Clover, or maybe just Clover, but they came together. But they ended up getting signed to a label called Kirshner Records, which was created by Don Kirshner, which if anybody grew up in the 70s, they know the name Don Kirshner because of Don Kirshner's rock concert, which was a big deal for seeing rock bands perform on TV. It was a late night, I think, syndicated show. Don Kirshner also famously, he's the Monkees. That's a creation of Don Kirshner. So Kirshner ended up distributed by CBS Records. First Kansas album came out in 1974, self-titled. This photo is actually a mural that's in the Kansas State Building. This is an abolitionist named John Brown, dude with the beard. If Kansas ever had a mascot of sorts, it would be this guy. No hit singles off that one. Didn't set the world on fire. They quickly followed it up in 1975 with Song for America, and this began what I think is some of the coolest cover art and the introduction of one of my favorite band logos here. I love the combination of the jagged lines and the circles to make the letters out of it. Another album in 75, this was that period where bands just started pumping out albums every single, twice a year sometimes. And this is called Mask. First three albums were sort of slowly selling, probably in the 150, 200,000 sales range as they were opening for various bands. And of course, everything changed in 1976 with this album, which if I had to make a guess, it's one of two guesses will be the sober choice, the more popular choice for best Kansas album. This is, of course, Leftoverture. Classic cover art. Just love this cover art. And of course, this contained Carry On Wayward Son. I mean, how many people don't know that song by now? It's gained life for use in movies and TV shows. I mean, it's sort of a ubiquitous song now, but it first appeared on this album, and it was a big hit single. Drove this album to eventually sell, I believe, 4 million copies. And this is a quadruple platinum album. Very, very big album for them. And they were stars, right? Very quickly, they follow it up with another album, which could be in contention for the sober choice of best Kansas album. Another fantastic piece of cover art, Point of No Return, 1977. The title song was a minor hit, but the big song off of this is a little song you may have heard of called Dust in the Wind. And of course, this was an even bigger hit single, crossed over to several markets, and they were a headlining arena selling band at this point. And like most every other big band of the 70s, what do? They do a double live album. Two for the Show, 1978. This went single platinum. Point of No Return, like Leftoverture, went 4 times platinum. Not in its initial life, but over time. And it was probably double platinum in its initial run. Uh, Follow that up with 1979, a very dark, very moody album called Monolith. I really like this one too. This one, some sources say it was platinum. Some sources say it was never certified platinum and only went gold. That's where the RIAA, that's where a lot of labels need to recertify some albums, I think. One that I could very easily argue as my favorite Kansas album, and the first one I ever heard all the way through, was 1980 Audio Visions. This was the last album that contained the original six-piece Kansas lineup, the original six-piece lineup as they were as a recording band. Then something really, really significant happened, and lead vocalist Steve Walsh left. He went on to form a band. He'd already done a solo album, but he went on to form a band called Streets, and they did a couple of albums for Atlantic Records, which much more of an AOR sort of 80s rock direction. This little album came out called Vinyl Confessions. We'll talk about this more. So on that album, the big significant change is they got a new lead singer. Lead singer's name is John Elephant. And then they pretty quickly followed it up in 1983 with this album, Drastic Measures, which contains really, really cool song, which doesn't really sound much like Kansas, called Fight Fire with Fire. This is the 45 picture sleeve. 1984, they've kind of reached the end of their contract with CBS. They released this album, The Best of Kansas, which is probably the most readily available thing. You can usually find this, most stores that still sell music. A good introduction to the band. This would eventually sell 3 million. So this is actually their third biggest selling album. So then, after like a couple years of hiatus, a reformed Kansas lineup appears. This time around with a guitarist that some people may have heard of named Steve Morse. And they signed with MCA Records, and they put out this album that is stuck for some reason. Hold on, there we go. The album Power. And they had a top 20 single with this song here, a song called All I Wanted. It was a short-lived era. They followed it up in 1988 with In the Spirit of Things. This was the last album they did for MCA. And then it was basically, like a lot of veteran bands at this point, back to doing clubs. The grunge scene happened, melodic rock, progressive rock. Unless you were way up there in the upper echelons like Rush or Yes, you were kind of back to doing smaller venues and basically rebuilding your audience. So the Reconfigured Kansas lineup puts out their first independent album in 1995, a really good album, I think, called Freaks of Nature. And then a couple things that I do not have on vinyl, because I don't think they exist on vinyl. 1998, they do an orchestral album, which is kind of a no-brainer for a band like that. It's called Always Never the Same. 4 new tracks and some remakes of classic songs. Then in the year 2000, the original 6-piece lineup plus their current bassist Billy Greer reunite to do a fine album called Somewhere to Elsewhere. Didn't do much, just on an independent label. And then it was many, many years later, Steve Walsh had returned as vocalist, of course, with the Power album. And he didn't want to do new Kansas music, and the rest of them did. So they kind of hemmed and hawed for a while, and finally he stepped down. They got a new lead singer, Ronnie Platt. Reconfigured lineup came back in 2016, which what I think is the first of 2 really, really strong albums. This is the Prelude Implicit. And just last year in 2020, another great album, The Absence of Presence. And a lot of lineup changes throughout the years, but the most significant lineup change we're going to talk about, and the most significant lineup change I think a band can ever go through, is when a band changes lead vocalists. And that's exactly what happened on Vinyl Confessions. And that is why I'm holding it up, because this is my choice, my contrarian choice for Best Kansas Album.
Tim, you did an excellent overview of all the Kansas records. We had a slight little conversation before we started recording about how underrated this band is, and I really think they are, which is interesting to say for a band that had like mega hits that they did, like Carry On My Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind and stuff like this. Like, to say that a band like that is underrated, but they really are underrated. And I know you're going to give us reasons why Vinyl Confessions is your contrarian choice. And you had mentioned something interesting, which I kind of agree with, is that like there's a couple of records that didn't even certify that are almost up for contention for like a contrarian choice, or a choice that some people might put alongside vinyl confessions. Like Power is one of the records that you had mentioned that I like a lot, but we'll get into that. Why don't you tell us why Vinyl Confessions is your favorite, or what your champion is as their best record, and then I'll give you some of the points of why it's not.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, as far as being underrated, they're just kind of in that mid, in the echelon of American classic rock bands. They're definitely, they sold a lot of albums. I mean, so we already talked about Leftoverture, Point of No Return being 4 million sellers, the best of being a million seller, Two for the Show, the live album, being a single million seller. But every one of the albums that the original band did in their initial run are all certified gold. So the first album, Song for America, Mask, Monolith, which may or may not be platinum, and Audio Visions. So obviously it's a band where once they got big, and this is something I would always do if I got into a band. If I found out they had older albums, they went back and bought them. And that doesn't happen. You don't hear that happening anymore. I mean, it happened with Kiss. I mean, their first 3 albums, it happened with Rush. Like, people just started investing in this band and they wanted to hear more from them. I could argue for Audio Visions, or I could argue for Power being, those are all 10s to me. But we're talking about Vinyl Confessions. Now, Vinyl Confessions is a very transitional record for them. I mean, it has to be the hardest thing a band can do, is replace the lead singer. They're the mouthpiece for the band. They're the sound of the band. You can have, musicianship just at its core. This is the finest musicianship ever. But when you lose your singer, that's usually it. AC/DC and Van Halen stand way, way out as exceptions to that rule, where bands, in AC/DC's case, they reached an entire new level of stardom. And in Van Halen, they definitely maintained they never had anything less than a multi-platinum album. They never didn't do well on tour. So with Kansas, it's interesting because this is a case where I really think that a lot of classic bands, either the labels or the bands themselves, whoever it is that has to go to RIAA, which I keep saying that's Recording Industry of America. It's the website RIAA.com is where you go to find out how bands sold, whether something was certified gold, platinum, multi-platinum, and when each of those certifications happen, which is interesting because you can see when a recertification process has happened, because all of a sudden in 2004, a whole bunch of new certifications happen. So usually it happens if a band has a bit of a comeback. In the case of Kansas, I think the CD age had a lot to do with that. As of right now, Vinyl Confessions has never certified, which I have to think this album went gold, sold enough to go gold. And the reason I say that is because first track on this was the first single, Play the Game Tonight. Fantastic, melodic, AOR, whatever you want to call it, rock song. Went to number 17 on the Billboard pop charts, not just the rock charts, but the pop charts. And the tour, however it went, was successful enough that this is actually when the band's first home video was ever recorded. Because back in, home video was a new concept in the early 80s. And there were a few bands that did them. Iron Maiden did Live at the Rainbow. April Wine did Live in London. These were the ones that probably retailed for $80, super expensive. And Kansas did one they called it Best of Kansas Live. It was a live concert filmed in Omaha, Nebraska, in front of what looks like a pretty big audience. And, features, I think, 7 of the 10 songs on this. It was reissued on a DVD. I think they called it Live Confessions. It's one of those things I've always meant to pick up, but I think it's available on YouTube. So they were still doing well as a touring act at this point, and they had a top 20 single. And I'm of the opinion that if Sony were to go back, I think they'd find this album certified gold. It's certainly worthy of it. Now, what happens on this album is John Elephant steps in. Now, that is not such a big change as some people might think, and a little bit of explanation is in order. First of all, Kansas were one of those bands that, and I hate this term, but it's a term that the Rolling Stone and the cool magazines would refer to these bands as faceless. In other words, there was no star, there was no Steven Tyler, there was no David Lee Roth. There was no one person that stood out in this band. So, when somebody said, "Oh, Steve Walsh left Kansas," and they'd be like, "What did he do?" Well, he was a lead vocalist or co-lead vocalist. Lead vocalist most of the time. He was definitely the front man. But a lot of people, they didn't really know what they looked like. This is pre-video. Well, there were videos, but it was it was just in that period where videos were just getting started. So they just happened to find a guy in John Elephant who I think sounds remarkably like Steve Walsh, was capable of singing all of the old Kansas material. And in some cases, because at this point, Steve Walsh apparently wasn't taking the best care of himself, his live performances started to suffer. And sadly, they really wouldn't get that much better, even though he still sounded pretty good, recorded on albums. But when I first got into Kansas back in 1992, one of the first things I bought was the best of. It had Play the Game Tonight, it had Fight Fire with Fire, and it had what was at the time a new track for the best of called Perfect Lover. So it was 3 out of the 10 songs on that CD had John Elephant on vocals. And this is pre-internet for me. I didn't realize it was a different singer. Now I can pick it out now. Obviously, I could pick it out. But for the masses, you wouldn't know. You really wouldn't know the difference. He had a very, very similar timbre to his voice, similar vocal range. He could sing really, really high. And so they rolled through that, I think, as smoothly as most bands ever could. And with this album, they would eventually, and one of the things I like about Kansas is because they have the prog side, but they also have a very melodic AOR side to them. And this album is kind of giving you a little bit of both. So Play the Game Tonight didn't really sound like much that Kansas had done before, even though it did include their trademark. I mean, the thing that when people talk about the prog bands, it's like, okay, Jethro Tull, okay, that's the band with the flute. Well, Kansas was the band with the violin. Robbie Steinhardt, their original violin player, and he also took some vocals on some songs, or shared the lead vocals with Steve Walsh. He's still in the band. And there's a little violin solo in Play the Game Tonight, which is surprising because by 1982, this was not a band that was, you would think would be having top 40 singles. But like I said, top 20 single would Play the Game Tonight. There's other songs on here right away. The second track, which I think was a single, it didn't do very well. It's a very commercial song, very poppy song. Actually contains some background vocals from Roger Taylor of Queen. I read that years later in a Queen book. And on the credits of this album, it just says special thanks to Roger. So I put it together and you can hear the highest harmony parts. That would be Roger. But it also has some very proggy sounding things on here. There's a great song, one of my favorites, but they actually did a video for, a very primitive video called Windows. Apparently that song dates back to 1977 because Kerry Livgren is the guitar player and the main songwriter of this band. This was almost the end of the line for him in the band too. But it fits perfectly with this album as well. Play On is a proggy type of song. Fair Exchange is a kind of a proggy Zeppelin-ish type of song. And it's got an acoustic ballad on here called Chasing Shadows, which is really good. I just think this is a good blend of the old and new Kansas. It was the perfect album to maybe reintroduce them because Audio Visions, their previous album, as much as I like it, the most successful song on that was the song Hold On, which actually peaked at number 40. So it wasn't a huge album for them at all. I think this one kind of got them a little bit back on track, which again is why I'm surprised that it was never certified gold. I mean, it's almost a bit of a comeback for them. Now, one thing I don't like about it is this. Like I said, they have one of my favorite band logos, and this looks like a children's book. It actually, what it reminds me of is one of those books that I don't know if people can realize or get what I'm talking about here, but you've ever had to sit with your kids in a dentist's office or something, and they'll have those books where there's like things hidden in the books that you have to find, almost like a Where's Waldo type of thing. This is what that reminds me of, that type of lettering. I don't know why they went for this. Obviously, you've got, this is kind of faded, but you've got a chair with a light shining down, like someone's, has to give a confession, like the police are questioning them in vinyl. Well, it's on vinyl. So anyway, I think this album is really, really good from start to finish. If you like 80s rock, you'll like this album. If you like a little bit of prog, you'll like this album. If you know Kansas from Carry On and Dust in the Wind, you might like this album. And I think more people need to check this out. That's why it's my contrarian choice.
First of all, I have to say I love Where's Waldo. So let's just leave Where's Waldo out of this for now, because I might get really mad if we start going down that path. But no, you know what? Actually, out of all the episodes that we've done on the Contrarians, you're kind of starting to flip me over a little bit, because I listened to this record a bunch this week and I actually like it quite a lot. And what's interesting too is you mentioned the member change, which is something that I had read in people's other criticisms or comments online about the record. But to be honest, I wasn't super familiar with Kansas after the 70s, and I wasn't super familiar with this record. And I listened to this record before I did any research. I just played it on Spotify. I just listened to it. I didn't even realize that they had changed the singer. So I'd have to concede that point to you. Now, I know if you're like a diehard Kansas fan, you would, like yourself, you might be able to tell the difference or whatever. But for me, I didn't realize that until after I had done some research. You had mentioned some of the songs on the record. So I will tell you like where I agree with you. Like I thought right away, the second track, I thought that sounded like a hit to me. Like that could have been a hit. I liked Fair Exchange a lot. I liked Face It a lot too. I think one of the things that they do really well on this record that they nail is just like the vocal harmonies, like you had mentioned. I think they nail it on this record. Windows, you had mentioned. Even Crossfire's good. There's some really good stuff on this record. There wasn't really anything on here that I thought was super weak, according to me subjectively. I did do some research. I did look at some critical reviews. All Music gave the record 3 stars and talked about like the religious lyrics as being one of the negative things about the record. It didn't even really bother me, the religious lyrics. So I can't even like go with that subjectively as something like, yeah, this record had too much religious. If you listen to Yes, I mean, like there was stuff on Yes that I thought stuck out more to me as being religious than listening to this record, to be honest. Some of the user reviews, one user review said it was their weakest record so far. They've lost a bit of the progressive rock performance. That was a direct quote. Another user review said Play the Game Tonight being one of the strongest Kansas singles ever. The rest of the album is palatable, but not much better than the tepid Audio Visions album. So they didn't really like Audio Visions, and said Chasing Shadows, Windows, and Crossfire are probably the most memorable tunes, but these aren't quite on the level of the prior classics. And that was a theme that I had noticed looking at when I was doing my research, that most of the individuals who rated this record said almost the same thing. Play the Game Tonight being one of the strongest Kansas songs ever. The rest of the album didn't quite live up to that, even that being the first track on the record. Nothing after that lived up to it. I kind of disagree with that a little bit. You had kind of already mentioned what the sober choices would be. Left Overture, Point of No Return, no being KNOW, those being kind of the top 2 picks. They were both quadruple platinum, like you had mentioned. Vinyl Confessions was the first record not to be certified. You could be right about technically selling enough to be certified. This is a conversation I've seen in other areas, like with Kiss and Creatures of the Night and stuff like this. Like, how is that not certified and stuff like that? Or I think Creatures of the Night is gold, but The Elder is not certified.
It took Creatures of the Night 12 years to certify as gold, which that blows my mind, because so many, like, it's one of my favorites. So many Kiss fans just love that album. So I don't think, you can't tell me it didn't sell. And by now The Elder must have.
Yeah, and The Elder was the one that's not been certified at all. But I think, and I've seen this conversation in other areas, we might have even had this conversation on the show, but I think part of that might be due to the fact that I think it actually costs money to get certified. And it might be something that like 20 years later, is it really worth it to go back and certify this record in the middle of the catalog that whoever's going to buy it's going to buy it anyways, whether it's certified or not, right? So you might be right about that. I think you brought up some really good points about that. Now, if you look at like ranking consensus, Left Overture is basically the general consensus being the number 1 Kansas record in like basically all the research that I did. Best albums ever put Left Overture as the top record, Kansas record, and that's one of the best ever albums. Is something that's very objective. So they take thousands of ranking reviews and stuff like this and put everything together and just basically with statistics put a list together of what a band's albums, what ranking they come in. And Vinyl Confessions ranked at number 14, which is pretty low. And in all of the rankings that I looked at, it consistently ranked pretty low. Progressive Music Planet ranked it tied at number 12 with Audio Visions, saying that Play the Game is a top Kansas song, like I had mentioned, but the rest of the record doesn't live up to it. And they had put Left Overture and Point and Overturn basically tied for number 1. Sea of Tranquility did a video ranking where they ranked all the Kansas records. Sea of Tranquility basically said that Vinyl Confessions was their number 10 out of 13 records, called it a synth-dominated 80s rock guitar sound. Not proggy as the earlier stuff, but sounds enough like Kansas on it. Basically called it an 80s pop Kansas with less of the 70s prog Kansas, which really is the classic Kansas sound. Left Overture for Sea of Tranquility was number 1. Kansas was number 2. Song for America was number 3, and Point and Overturn was number 4. And in Sea of Tranquility also did a top 10 Kansas songs video, and there were no representatives of from Vinyl Confessions. So obviously, probably the 2 top records would be Point and Overturn, which has the big hit Dust in the Wind on it. And Left Overture has the big hit Carry on My Wayward Son on it. But I think, and this was a bit of a conversation we had before we started recording, I think the thing about those 2 records is not only you have those giant massive hits, but if you dig beneath those hits, they're actually pretty excellent records. I mean, Point and Overturn has Spider on it, which is an instrumental that like could have been a Yes track off of anything they had done in the 70s. Paradox is really cool off of Point and Overturn as well. Left Overture, everybody and their grandmothers heard Carry on My Wayward Son a million times on the radio. But I mean, beyond that, What's on My Mind is super cool and progressive. Again, Sea of Tranquility had The Wall as one of their top 3 Kansas songs ever. Magnum Opus is on that one. The instrumentation on Left Overture is just so well put together. The production is so good. The lead work all over the place is inspiring. Like I love Left Overture, and I probably would agree with the general consensus to say that that definitely gripped me more than Vinyl Confessions, even though I actually liked Vinyl Confessions quite a lot. And also in their live set list representation. On Setlist FM, they take a statistics of all the records and all the songs that were played live in their set lists. And the most represented record was Point and Overturn. The second most represented record was Left Overture. Vinyl Confessions came in at 10th. So Setlist FM basically had Vinyl Confessions as 10th as their least represented live albums, and most of that came from Play the Game Tonight. Now, you could be, like you had mentioned, some other albums that you could be contrarian on, and I think that's the thing with Kansas is I think there's probably a few records, like you had said, Audio Visions was one of them, but I really like the record Power, and I thought there was some really cool stuff on that, and like that could even be a contrarian pick. Like the title track actually reminds me of like an 80s hair metal type of thing, but I dig it. But I mean, like Can't Cry Anymore is on Power, which is probably one of the greatest Steve Walsh vocals out of anything they ever did. 3 Pretenders was on that one. All I Wanted was on that one. I would, if I was going to go contrarian, I might even go with that above Vinyl Confessions. So I would probably put Left Overture, Point and Overturn, yeah, number 1 and 2. Power is really cool. The self-titled record Kansas is really cool. Vinyl Confessions is a great record. I just don't quite think it lives up to the classic 70s stuff. And I think kind of even Power kind of overtakes it a little bit in my rankings. So those are some of the objective things that I had found online. Do you have any follow-up to any of that?
Well, yeah, it's really hard to argue with those 2 records. They are amazing records, but you can really see if it's a flow chart. You can totally see what a hit single does for your album sales, because you've got gold, 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 quadruple platinum, platinum, live album that follows, gold, gold. One hit single. They're 2 iconic, calling card songs, one on each of those albums, and the best of has both of them. So that comes in third. Yeah, no, that's hard to argue with. And live, I mean, they always do Paradox, they always do Portrait, or a lot, maybe not always. Portrait, he knew, The Wall, at least part of Magnum Opus, Cheyenne Anthem. As a matter of fact, in recent years, they did a live album and they did a tour where they did all of Left Overture with other songs. I think they did a set before, and then they did all of Left Overture, and then like a couple of encore songs, and then they did the same thing for Point of No Return. They put a Left Overture Live and Beyond live album out, and the end of May they're putting out the Point of No Return live album, which had already previously been recorded. You're not likely to see Vinyl Confessions Live and Beyond, although, like I said, on the tour for that album, at least the show that was filmed and released on home video, they did 7 of the 10 songs. There were a lot of songs on that concert, and they still managed to get in, all the classic songs that anybody would want. They were just really pushing that album, which is very cool. Now, Power, man, I got to tell you, it's tempting. I almost went with Power or Audio Visions too. And to me, like, this is when I first became aware of Kansas. I saw the video for All I Wanted, so I was 12. I didn't really know anything. I didn't know anything about them until then. And they also did a video for Can't Cry Anymore, which is a great ballad, which should have charted. All I Wanted hit number 19, not bad. They were on MCA Records, which, new record label. I have to think they didn't really push it as much as they should have, because this had the potential to do for Kansas what 90125 did for Yes, I think. Because after, and it's very similar in that both of these bands took like 2-3 year hiatus where they weren't in the public eye anymore and other members were doing other things. But you could listen to this album if you just liked 80s rock. You didn't necessarily have to be a card-carrying member of Kansas Fan Club and know anything about what they've done previously. This is just a good AOR album. Some hard rock moments on here. You've got Steve Morse on guitar. You've got Silhouettes in Disguise is a heavy song. We're Not Alone Anymore is a really complicated, fast shuffle. Like you said, Three Pretenders is kind of a heavy one. Tomb 19 is like, Tomb 19 and Power are really, really catchy songs, which could have been soundtrack songs. They kind of sound like 80s soundtrack songs. Oh yeah, this is a great, great album. But I'm going with Vinyl Confessions because to me, it's the bridge between the old and the new, and I think they do it quite well. And it's funny, I've watched most of Pete's videos on Sea of Tranquility, and it's pretty obvious he's a Kansas fan. I mean, he's interviewed guys from the band, which is really cool. But when you talked about the synths and sounding like very 80s rock on Vinyl Confessions, to me, that's more the case with Drastic Measures, which is the second of the two Elephant albums. That album really breaks away. And if anybody knows the song Fight Fire with Fire, great song, doesn't sound anything like Kansas. If it came on, you might think, well, who's this? Is this, is this some Styx song I've never heard before? Or is it doesn't sound like Kansas. And most of that album sounds like that. It's really not progressive at all. And it's got that 80s, I think Neil Kernan produced that album. It's got a very 80s drum sound, and, that's really the album where I'd go more about really synthy, even though I do like it. It's not overall, it's probably my least favorite Kansas album is probably In the Spirit of Things, and maybe Drastic Measures next, but I like all of their albums. But for me, Vinyl Confessions just strikes that perfect balance between, if you like a little bit of the prog, you got it. But if you like the AOR stuff, it's there in spades. And honestly, as a kid growing up in the 80s, other than I've always been a Rush fan. Most of my favorite bands were the more melodic, like I like Journey and Night Ranger. And so to me, when Kansas does that, they do it extremely well. And that's why I'm going to beat the drum for Vinyl Confessions, even though I know it's not really the sober choice.
Yeah, no, and your pick is kind of winning me over a little bit here too. So we're kind of convincing each other a little bit. But and the other thing is, the name of your YouTube channel is Vinyl Confessions. Is that where you got the name of your channel, from that record?
It absolutely is. Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I wasn't going to come right out with it, but since you mentioned it, yeah, that's why. And my very, very first episode was going through all my Kansas vinyl again. Like I beat the drum for this band, and a lot of people are like, oh yeah, Kansas, Carrie Ann Wayward Sun, Dust in the Wind. I'm like, yeah. Listen, go deeper. There's a vast catalog here, and really, even in their more recent years, their last two albums are right up there. I haven't ranked them per se, but Absence of Presence and The Prelude Implicit are just amazing sounding albums. Like, there's moments on there, like if somebody was way into Dream Theater, you might like some of the stuff on here, because it is more modern sounding, more modernly produced. But those two mid-period albums they did independently, Freaks of Nature and Somewhere to Elsewhere, there's good material on all of them. Like I said, my least favorite being In the Spirit of Things, it was the second of the two albums they did with Steve Morse, second of the two MCA years. I think that one suffers from, there was a lot of outside songs that were handed to them. They were really trying to break this band commercially. And that's an album that, it's funny because before I got into the band, I was always looking in music stores. I think I saw that album in the delete bins more than I ever saw it in the new release section. It's like MCA put it out and then that's it. Even though there is a pretty good King Biscuit Flower Hour live CD from that tour. Another thing about Vinyl Confessions and the John Elefant era in general is that when Steve Walsh came back to the band, they still did Fight Fire with Fire and Play the Game Tonight in concert, which that rarely happens when a singer leaves and then comes back and there was a replacement singer in between. I mean, one of the big exceptions, and I think that's really cool, like when Bruce Dickinson came back to Iron Maiden, was the Klansman they did from the Blaze Bayley years. But Rob Halford, I've read where he said he refuses to listen to the Ripper Owens albums. He can't imagine listening to a Judas Priest album that he isn't on.
And Kiss. Ace and Peter did Lick It Up and Heaven's on Fire when they came back. When they did the farewell tour.
Not to get off course too much, but it's funny because up until that farewell tour, there was and this is right when you were getting into Kiss, but I saw them. When I saw them. I saw them in '96 and '98. At that time, there was a very thick line drawn in between makeup and non-makeup years. It's almost like they treated everything from Lick It Up to Revenge like it didn't exist, and the Kiss set list ended in 1979. But they did come around, and their most recent set list, they're doing Tears Are Falling and Crazy Crazy Nights. So that's a good thing. But it's like, and I know Martin has said this about talking to Ian Gillan about, like, why don't you guys ever do Burn or Stormbringer? Some of the David Coverdale stuff. It's like, oh, why would we do that? The fans would love it. Like, it's, there's a certain amount of ego involved, right?
Right.
And some of these guys, I don't think can get over themselves enough to do it. But Steve Walsh was obviously like, hey, these are songs that people know by Kansas. Let's put them in the set. And right. You mentioned about, again, about them being underrated. The fact of the matter is that they charted 7 top 40 singles in Billboard. And a lot of people would be surprised to hear that because they're like, well, I only know 2. Maybe if they're really on their game, they'll know Point of No Return. But obviously, Dust in the Wind was the highest one. I think it got to number 6 or number 7. Carry On went to number 11. The third biggest song is Play the Game Tonight, which peaked at number 17. Right behind that is All I Wanted at 19. Good point. And then I think the next one is a song called On Monolith called People of the South Wind, which, by the way, is the literal translation of Kansas. It's the Kansas Indian tribe, or the people of the South Wind. I think that hit number 23, which is surprising because it's a very uncommercial song. Hold On hit number 40. And I think the song Point of No Return hit number 28 or something like that. But when you have a band like that, that's not, they're not Foreigner, or they're not, they're not Styx. They're not expected to have top 20, top 10 singles all the time. I think Kansas did quite well out there. Like when the record company would release songs to radio, and then there were a bunch of songs, and Right Away being one of them, that charted in the Billboard Hot 100. They just didn't hit the top 40. And a lot of songs that I think should have been singles that weren't. And like I said, how MCA didn't make Power into a multi-platinum album in 1986 just shows me that they didn't do the right promotion, because it's not like, the band was revitalized, but we're talking about Vinyl Confessions here. And also, I think another factor is that this is a band that had been going for quite a long time at this point. I'm talking about 1982 when Vinyl Confessions was out. And I think, bands like back then, Cheap Trick's a band that comes to mind. They signed these long contracts. And I think a lot of the times the record label was just like, just put the thing out. Are they still with us? That kind of thing. So there wasn't going to be a lot of the chances of them having a hit at this point. A lot of it has to do with the record company and how much money they were willing to spend on promotion. A good example of that is the album Passion Works by Heart, which came out in 1983, which is the same reconfigured lineup that came back in 85 with the self-titled album. It had all those #1 singles and like 5 times platinum. Passion Works is a good album. And it's got that same lineup, that it was the last album they did for Epic CBS. And there was no promotion. None of the songs hit the top 40. It wasn't certified. I think with Kansas, with these last 2 albums, I think maybe CBS just said, look, they've got 2 albums left in their contract. Let's just put the things out, send them out on tour, and then we can throw the best of out and be done with it. And really, the band came to an end, a natural end too. At that point too, Kerry Livgren left the band. He wanted to go into Christian contemporary music. That was a big divide. As a matter of fact, the song Crossfire, my understanding is that it was the song Crossfire that was Steve Walsh's last straw with the band when he decided to leave. But like you said before, and I'll say it, Kansas lyrics have always been on the spiritual side. You know, listen to Carry On Wayward Sons, you know, surely heaven waits for you. You know what I mean? I don't think they don't beat you over the head with anything one way or another. So I think it's the fact that it was a very internal thing, and Steve Walsh knew what it was, that, you know, the lyrics he was being handed to sing, and he wasn't down with it. But where was I going with that? Anyway, that led to the band dissolving in 84. But of course, they got back together in 86 with a slightly different lineup. One of the interesting things is that lineup included Billy Greer, who was the bass player in Streets, which was Steve Walsh's side project band. Now, Streets put out 2 albums on Atlantic Records, like I think I'd said that earlier. The first song on their first album was the only one that charted it all. Great tune called If Love Should Go. If you listen to that and you listen to Fight Fire with Fire side by side, they don't sound all that different. So it's really interesting. They were kind of both pursuing the same sound at the same time, which I think is one of the reasons that Power is such a great album. But so is Vinyl Confessions. I'm arguing against, you know, I could argue a 3-way, you know, contrarian choice: Vinyl Confessions, Power, Audio Visions. I love all 3 of them. But Vinyl Confessions, I think, is the one that stands out. As I think a lot of people dismiss it, and a lot of people that say that it's not that good. I don't know if they've listened to it all the way through. They really should. And listen to it back to back with Left Overture, with Point of No Return. No, maybe it's not as proggy all the way through, but if you're just listening for good songs with memorable melodies and really good playing, it's still there.
Very cool. I don't think anybody's going to argue that you don't know Kansas. I mean, you must.
They're one of my favorite bands. If that hasn't
absolutely
bled through by now.
Very cool. Very cool pick. Vinyl Confessions was the pick. Vinyl Confessions is also the name of Tim's YouTube channel. So go check out Tim's YouTube channel. We also have our Patreon thing going on. We did a really cool live chat on our Patreon. So I hope we're going to be able to continue that in the future. So if you join our Patreon, you'll be able to join our live chats. Also, we have our channel if you want to subscribe and like our channel. And that was Tim's pick today was Vinyl Confessions. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let us know in the comments what you think. Is maybe there another Kansas Contrarian choice? Is Kansas the biggest underrated band that's, you know, around, or is there other bands that have these huge hits but are super underrated because people don't look at the rest of their catalog, right? So that's a cool conversation too. Other than that, I guess we'll kind of agree because I kind of like Vinyl Confessions, but disagree because I think Left Overture and Point of No Return probably are the top Kansas records. And I guess we'll live on to fight another day. And thanks a lot, Tim, for stopping by. And I guess we'll see y'all next time.
Thanks, Marco. Thanks, everybody, for watching.
That's it, dude.